mother-in-law handed me an eviction notice at my own kitchen table, 3 days after my son's funeral. She called it a transition plan. I called it what it was. My name is Leonard Ashworth. I'm 64 years old, and I've lived in this house since before my son knew how to walk. What happened in the weeks after we buried him taught me something I should have known decades ago. The people who mistake your silence for weakness are always the most surprised when you finally speak. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. My son, Nathan, died on a Tuesday in late October. Black ice on the Trans-Canada, just west of Thunder Bay. He was 41 years old. He'd driven that stretch 100 times for work, and then one morning he didn't. The OPP officer who came to my door was younger than Nathan. I remember thinking that while he was talking. I don't remember much else from that conversation. What I remember clearly is my daughter-in-law arriving at my house 40 minutes later, still wearing her work blazer, already on her phone. She didn't hug me. She sat down at the kitchen table where Nathan and I used to play cribbage, opened her laptop, and started making lists. "The funeral home," she said. "We need to call the funeral home. We." As if she were doing me a favor by including me in the word. Her name was Sandra Kowalczyk before she married Nathan, Sandra Ashworth after. She worked in commercial real estate out of an office on Bay Street in Toronto. She was efficient. She was composed. She was, as I would come to understand, already calculating. Nathan and I had always been close in the way that quiet people are close. Not a lot of words, but a lot of understanding. He'd grown up in this house, in Sudbury, in a neighborhood where the birch trees came right up to the back fence and the winters lasted 6 months and nobody complained about it because that was just how it was. He moved to Toronto for work in his late 20s, met Sandra at a conference, and married her 3 years later. They had a good life. I never interfered. When Margaret, my wife, passed away from cancer 4 years ago, Nathan started making the drive up from Toronto more regularly, not every weekend, but enough. He'd help me with things around the house. A leaky Eviction, a stretch of fence that needed replacing. We'd sit on the back porch in the evening and talk. Or not talk, depending on the night. Sandra came occasionally. She was always polite. She was always somewhere else in her head. After the funeral, which Sandra organized with the same crisp efficiency she'd applied to everything else, she stayed for 4 days. On the 4th day, she sat across from me at that kitchen table and said, very calmly, that we needed to discuss my situation. My situation. I asked her what she meant. She said that with Nathan gone, things would have to change, that the house was, of course, part of Nathan's estate, and that as his wife, she was the primary beneficiary. That I was welcome to stay through Christmas, but after that we'd need to figure out something more suitable for a man in my position. A man in my position. I was 64 years old. I drove a 10-year-old Silverado with 200,000 kilometers on it. I wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation from October to April. I did not, from the outside, look like a man who needed to be handled carefully. I said quietly that I appreciated her thinking of me. She took that as agreement. That was her first mistake. Sandra left for Toronto the next morning. Before she backed out of the driveway, she told me not to worry about the property tax notice that had come in the mail. She'd have her accountant look into it. I nodded and waved and waited until she turned the corner. Then I went inside and made coffee. I want to tell you something about grief, because people talk about it like it's one thing, and it isn't. In the first week after Nathan died, I was mostly just numb, moving through the days like I was underwater. But underneath the numbness, there was something else. A very clear, very cold anger. Not at the ice on the highway, not at God or fate, or any of those things you're supposed to rage at. At Sandra, at the way she had walked through my house after the service, opening cupboards, standing in doorways with her head tilted slightly, assessing. I'd seen that look before. It's the look appraisers get. The property tax notice she'd offered to handle. That was interesting to me, because the property tax notice was addressed to Leonard Ashworth, not to Nathan's estate, not to Sandra, to me. Because this house, this two-story brick house on Lorne Street in Sudbury, had never belonged to Nathan in any legal sense. He'd grown up here. He'd called it home, but the title had always been mine. Margaret and I bought it in 1989. Cash, mostly from the sale of a smaller place I'd owned before we married. I was a licensed electrician back then, and I'd spent 8 years doing contract work in the mining sector. Inco, then Vale, saving methodically the way my father had taught me. We raised Nathan here. We replaced the roof twice, the furnace once, and the kitchen countertops when Margaret finally lost patience with the laminate. The deed had never changed. It had never needed to. Nathan knew this, of course. He'd seen the documents when he was helping me organize my files after Margaret died. He understood the financial structure of our family well enough. What he'd apparently never done was explain any of it to Sandra. This is the part I've thought about many times since. Nathan was a good man. He was also, like his father, someone who assumed people would ask if they wanted to know. He didn't volunteer information. He helped his father practically, drove me to the cardiologist twice a year, fixed the gutter when he visited, wired me money for the new water heater when I was between contracts. And Sandra saw that generosity and constructed her own version of what it meant. She assumed Nathan was propping up a failing old man. She assumed the house would come to her because everything in Nathan's life must have come from Nathan's efforts. She was a real estate professional. She had never checked the land registry. I found that, genuinely, almost funny, not funny enough to tell her immediately. I needed to think. 2 weeks after the funeral, Sandra called. She told me she was coming back up to Sudbury the following weekend with a colleague, a contractor she trusted, to get a sense of what updates the house might need before they listed it. I said very mildly that was a long drive for a weekend. She said it was worth it to get the process moving. She said the Sudbury market had actually been quite strong, and she expected the house to sell quickly once it was staged properly. I said I'd make sure the coffee was on. She thanked me. She sounded relieved that I was being cooperative. I'm going to be honest with you. Part of me wanted to tell her right then, lay it out clearly and efficiently, the way she communicated herself, and watch the realization land. But I thought about something my father used to say when I was young, that the man who speaks too early loses his best argument. So I waited. Sandra arrived that Saturday with her contractor and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be her colleague from the Toronto office. They walked through my house like it was already a listing. The colleague made notes on her tablet. The contractor pointed at the kitchen ceiling with a pencil and mentioned asbestos remediation, which there was no basis for, but which apparently sounds impressive. Sandra talked about an open concept renovation, removing the wall between the kitchen and the living room, the wall Margaret and I had wallpapered together in 1994, the one with the small pencil marks near the baseboard where we'd tracked Nathan's height until he left for university. I sat in my chair in the living room and listened to all of this. At one point, the contractor walked up to me and said, in that slightly too loud voice some people use with older men, that the house had good bones. I told him I knew. I'd chosen the bones myself. He laughed like I'd made a joke. Sandra sat across from me before they left. She said she'd been in touch with a senior's residence in the South End, a newer building, she said, very nice, very modern, and that they had a one-bedroom available in February. She'd spoken to someone there about she paused, my particular needs. I asked what particular needs those were. She said that living alone in a large house at my age was a lot to manage. I told her I'd managed it for 4 years since Margaret passed without any trouble. She said that was different, that Nathan had been there to help. I looked at her steadily for a moment. I asked her what, specifically, Nathan had helped me with financially. She listed things. The water heater, a dental procedure 2 years back. Groceries, she thought, occasionally. I said that Nathan had given me money for the water heater and I had paid him back within the month. That I had paid for my own dental work out of my RRSPs. That Nathan sometimes brought groceries the way you bring someone groceries when you visit, not because they can't afford food, but because it's a kind thing to do on a long drive. Sandra's expression did something complicated. She said that wasn't how Nathan had described it. I asked her gently how Nathan had described it. She hesitated. She said he'd told her I was on a fixed income and that he tried to help where he could. I am on a fixed income, I said. I'm retired. That's what retired means. It doesn't mean what you seem to think it means. She left shortly after. Her colleague and the contractor had already gone to their car. I watched them back out of the driveway, and then I went to my study. I have a fireproof filing cabinet in my study. It is gray, 4 drawers, and it has sat in that corner since 1997. Margaret thought it was an eyesore. I told her that organized records were a form of self-respect. We compromised by putting a plant on top of it. The plant died in 2003, and I never replaced it, but I kept the filing cabinet. I pulled out the bottom drawer. The house deed was where it had always been, a folder labeled Lorne Street, Title and Purchase, sitting between the folder for the Silverado and the folder for Margaret's estate documents. I unfolded it and read it, though I already knew what it said. Owner of record, Leonard James Ashworth. Purchase date, March 22nd, 1989. No mortgage registered. No co-owners listed. Mine, without complication, for 35 years. Beside the deed folder was another one I want to tell you about. After Margaret died, I worked with a financial planner in Sudbury, a woman named Eleanor Park, who had been handling our investments since the late 90s. Eleanor had helped me restructure things after the estate settled. We'd moved the bulk of our savings into a TFSA and a non-registered account, kept my pension income from my years with the electrical union separate, and organized everything with a clear beneficiary structure. The total, as of the last statement in October, was not what Sandra imagined when she thought about a 64-year-old widower driving an old truck and shopping with a senior's discount card. I sat in my study for a long time that evening. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Osei. She had an office on Elm Street downtown, and she had handled Margaret's estate 4 years ago. She was calm and methodical, and she did not waste words, which I appreciated. I brought her the deed. I brought her the property tax records, 35 years of them, all paid by Leonard Ashworth, all verifiable through the City of Greater Sudbury's records. I brought her the MPAC assessment notices, the insurance policy documents, the utility account histories. I brought the folder Eleanor Park had prepared, summarizing my investment accounts, and the registered beneficiaries. Nathan's life insurance came up too. He'd held a policy through his employer, a group benefit, a substantial one. Sandra had already mentioned it to me in the way people mention things they consider settled. She'd assumed she was the primary beneficiary. She was the secondary beneficiary. Nathan had named his estate as primary, with a specific clause directing those proceeds to me in the event that he predeceased me without children. He'd done this. According to the note he'd left with the policy documents in my filing cabinet, he'd given me a copy years ago during one of his visits, because he wanted to make sure I was protected if anything ever happened to him. I sat with that for a while after I found it. Patricia reviewed everything and said, matter-of-factly, that Sandra had no legal claim to the house, no claim to the insurance proceeds, and no standing to make any decisions about the property. She said we had several options for how to proceed. I told her I wanted Sandra to understand this fully, in a setting where it couldn't be misremembered or reinterpreted later. I told her I wanted her to hear it the way she'd made me hear things, clearly, and in front of other people. Patricia asked me if I was sure. I said I'd been sure since the day Sandra sat at my kitchen table and called me a situation. Patricia made the arrangements. She contacted Sandra's lawyer. Sandra had apparently already retained one, which told me she'd been moving faster than I'd realized, and requested a meeting the following Thursday. Patricia suggested Sandra's lawyer's office in Toronto, which was neutral ground. She also suggested, and this was my addition, that Sandra be asked to have her real estate colleague present, since that person had been involved in discussions about the property. The colleague showed up. The contractor did not, which was fine. The lawyer's boardroom on King Street was enough of a stage. I drove down to Toronto Wednesday night and stayed in a hotel near the waterfront. I ate breakfast alone and took a walk along the lake before the meeting. It was early November, gray and cold, the kind of cold that settles into the stones around Lake Ontario and doesn't leave until April. I've always liked that kind of cold. It's honest. Sandra was already seated when Patricia and I arrived. Her lawyer was a younger man, very pressed, very confident. Her colleague from the office sat to one side with her tablet. Sandra looked at me the way people look at you when they expect us to be uncomfortable but manageable. She had the composure of someone who handles difficult conversations professionally. Patricia set 3 folders on the table. Sandra's lawyer opened by saying that his client was hoping to reach a mutually agreeable resolution regarding the estate. That his client recognized this was a sensitive time and wanted to ensure Leonard's needs were taken care of in the transition. Patricia let him finish. Then she opened the first folder and placed the deed on the table. She said the property at Lorne Street had been owned solely and continuously by Leonard James Ashworth since 1989, that Nathan Ashworth had no registered interest in the property at any point, that Sandra Ashworth, therefore, had no claim through inheritance, survivorship, or any other mechanism. Sandra's lawyer reached for the deed. He read it. He read it again. Sandra looked at her colleague. Her colleague was looking at the paper. Patricia opened the second folder, 35 years of property tax receipts, all issued to Leonard Ashworth, all paid by Leonard Ashworth. Insurance documents, utility histories, impact records. Sandra's lawyer said, quietly, that his client had not been aware of this structure. Patricia said she understood that. She said that, unfortunately, being unaware of the ownership structure of a property was a significant oversight, particularly for someone whose profession involved real estate transactions. The colleague's tablet made no sound. I don't think she was taking notes anymore. Patricia opened the third folder. She explained the life insurance policy, the employer group benefit, the beneficiary designation, the clause directing proceeds to my estate in the specific circumstances that had occurred. She said the insurance company had already been notified and the claim was being processed accordingly. Sandra said something then. She said she hadn't known. Patricia said that was evident. Sandra looked at me, and for the first time since Nathan died, she looked like herself. Not the version she'd been performing, not the efficient one, the composed one. Just a 40-year-old woman who'd lost her husband and had spent 6 weeks constructing a future from assumptions, and was now watching that construction come apart in a boardroom on King Street. I want to be honest about what I felt. Not triumph, exactly. Something more complicated. She had treated me badly. The eviction notice at the kitchen table, the contractor pointing at my ceilings, the senior's residence brochure, the word situation. Those things were real, and they had been unkind, but she had also lost her husband. Whatever her faults, that was real too. I said to her directly, Sandra, if you'd asked me, I would have told you. If you'd asked me about the house, about the finances, about any of it, we could have had a different conversation, one that was better for both of us. She didn't say anything. I said, I understand you're grieving. I am too. But grief isn't a reason to take what isn't yours. Her lawyer murmured something. She shook her head at him slightly. Patricia outlined the legal position clearly. Sandra was welcome to collect Nathan's personal effects from the house. She was not entitled to the property, the insurance proceeds, or any claim against my estate. Patricia noted that Nathan's personal accounts, his car, his Toronto condo, which was rented and fully in his name, his individual savings, would be distributed according to his will, which did leave the majority of those assets to Sandra. She would not be left with nothing. She would not have what she'd expected. That was different. We shook hands, or something resembling it, in the lobby. Sandra's colleague left without making eye contact with me. The lawyer was professionally composed. Sandra paused by the door. She said she was sorry for the way she'd spoken to me. I said I accepted that. She said she hadn't realized about the house, about any of it, and that she'd made assumptions. I said that was clear. I said that assuming is a habit that tends to be most expensive, precisely when you can least afford it. She nodded. She left. Patricia and I walked out into the November cold. She said that had gone about as well as it could have. I said I thought so too. The drive back to Sudbury took 4.5 hours. I stopped in Perry Sound for gas and a coffee. I sat in the truck in the parking lot for a few minutes before getting back on the highway, looking at the tree line and thinking about Nathan. He would have found the whole thing quietly amusing, I think. He'd inherited my preference for understatement. He would have raised an eyebrow and said something like, "Well, that's sorted then." He would not have made a speech about it. I got home around 10. Made toast and tea, sat in my chair in the living room, the one that faces the back window, where you can see the birch trees in the dark, if there's enough snow on the ground to reflect the light. In February, I got a card in the mail. Sandra's handwriting. She'd moved back to Winnipeg, where her family was from. She said she hoped I was well. She said she'd been thinking about things, about Nathan, about the way she'd behaved in those weeks after the funeral. She said she wasn't proud of it. She hoped I could understand that she'd been frightened. I could understand that. Fear makes people do things that look like cruelty, but are really just panic wearing a different coat. I wrote her back, a short letter. I told her I hoped Winnipeg was good to her. I told her that Nathan had spoken well of her in the years before things had become strained. I told her I didn't carry any of it forward. I meant that. But I want to say one thing clearly. To anyone watching this who has been in a version of what I went through, maybe not this exact situation, but something like it, someone who looked at your quiet life and decided it meant you were powerless, someone who mistook your patience for permission. You are not obligated to make yourself small to make someone else comfortable. You are not required to correct people immediately when they misjudge you, but you are allowed, and I would say you are responsible, to defend what is rightfully yours, calmly, with evidence, in full daylight. Silence isn't the same as surrender. Sometimes it's just preparation. The house is still on Lorne Street. The birch trees are still at the back fence. The filing cabinet is still in the study, gray and unchanged, plant-free since 2003. Some things don't need to change just because someone decided they should. If any of this resonates with you, if you've been dismissed because of your age, your quietness, your old truck, or your flannel shirt, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. And if you know someone who needs this reminder, I hope you'll share it with them. Until next time, I've thought a lot about what I would say if Nathan could hear me now. Not about Sandra, not about the deed or the boardroom or any of it, just I think I handled it the way you would have wanted me to. Quietly. With evidence. Without making it uglier than it needed to be. That's the thing about cause and effect that people don't like to talk about plainly. It doesn't require anyone's intervention. It doesn't need to be orchestrated. Sandra made a series of choices in those weeks after Nathan died, and each one followed from the last with a kind of internal logic that I couldn't have designed if I'd tried. She assumed. She acted on the assumption. She involved witnesses. She put things in writing. She sat across from a real estate colleague and described renovations to a house she had never legally had any claim to. And then the natural consequence of those choices arrived, not as punishment from anyone, but simply as the truth filling the space her assumptions had left open. I didn't do that to her. She did it to herself. I just didn't stop her. That distinction matters to me. I've never been comfortable with the idea of revenge as a goal. It implies you're still working from anger, still letting the other person set the terms. What I did was simpler than that. I stayed patient. I gathered my documents. I found a good lawyer. I chose the right moment and the right room. Those are not acts of vengeance. They're acts of self-respect. The tricky part, and I say this as honestly as I can, is that self-respect requires you to actually know who you are. Sandra could only see what I appeared to be, an older man in a flannel shirt driving a truck with high mileage, living in a house that needed new countertops. She built her entire strategy on that surface. And I understand the temptation. We all read surfaces. The difference is that a person of genuine intelligence learns, early and often, that surfaces are unreliable data. Nathan understood that. He'd watched me my whole life, and he knew that the quiet way I moved through the world was not absence. It was patience. He used to say, when he was a teenager and frustrated with something, "Dad, you never seem worried." And I'd tell him that worry was mostly just imagination, pointed in the wrong direction. Better to point it toward preparation. I'm not a particularly wise man. I'm a retired electrician from Sudbury who kept his filing cabinet organized and paid his taxes on time. But I think there's something in that, in the discipline of maintaining your own house, literally and otherwise. knowing what you own, knowing what you've built, not needing someone else to validate it for you. Sandra needed the world to see her as capable and in control. And when Nathan died and the structure she'd built around that need started to feel uncertain, she reached for something solid. My house, my money, my identity as a dependent, and tried to make it hers. That's not cruelty in the purest sense. That's fear, moving fast, but fear that moves fast and doesn't stop to ask questions causes damage. And the damage it causes has a way of coming back around to its source. I hope she's doing well in Winnipeg. I meant that when I wrote it, but I also hope she learned something she won't forget, that dignity isn't visible on the surface, that assumptions are a form of laziness, and that the quietest person in the room is often the one who's most prepared to speak.